Why did the Japanese hate fighting American Marines more than any other unit? What was it about the Leatherneck who stepped off the LVT, crawled across reef and coral, and kept coming, that made island commanders whisper warnings and rewrite doctrine? What did Japanese officers learn in the months and years after Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, Saipan, and Iwo Jima that changed how they fought and how they feared when the stars and bars first hit the sand? Subscribe to the channel and unravel the forgotten stories and secrets of World War II, and let us begin. The first images that come to mind are not medals or maps, but a sound. The dull, relentless thud of naval guns falling like weather, the slap of waves against landing craft, the rattle of an M1 rifle as it is shoulder-bolted and aimed. In the Pacific, the Marines arrived by sea, by steel and sweat, and with a doctrine welded to the idea that no beach was too hostile to take. From a Japanese perspective, this was not merely another Allied unit. Amphibious assault was in the Marines' bones. They perfected the choreography of tide, steel, and Menhiggins boats, LVTs, coordinated naval gunfire and carrier air to make the earliest precious minutes ashore worth an army, where other Allied units fought inland. The Marines specialized in the shock of crossing the blue, and that made them uniquely dangerous in the eyes of defenders who had thought the ocean a shield. At Tarawa in November 1943, those abstractions hardened into a lesson of brutal clarity. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki had boasted that it would take 1 million Americans 100 years to take Bech. By the end of the first 3 days, the atoll had been seized at terrible cost to the attackers, an enormous shock to the defenders. Tarawa signaled a harsh calculus. The Marines could be bled, yes, but they would keep coming, and they would improvise under fire. They would find a way ashore even if the tide betrayed them. Marine commanders learned lessons about landing craft and tides, and Japanese commanders learned and respected the Marine capacity for improvisation and endurance. Tarawa became a turning point in how both sides adjusted. The Marines sharpened logistics and combined arms. Japanese planners retooled defenses into deeper, tougher networks intended to bleed the invader until victory by sacrifice. That adaptation by the Japanese, the shift from beachline brawls to defense in depth, was itself a testimony to the fear and grudging respect the Marines inspired. After early defeats, the Imperial General Staff ceased to mass troops on exposed beaches and began carving the rock caves with machine guns, interlocking pillboxes, hidden galleries tunneled into volcanic cores. The Marines' response was equally resolute and methodical: flamethrowers and demolition, coordinated artillery and close air, infantry trained to crawl into darkness and root out the last man. The psychological effect of flame and blast on confined defenders is not merely one of bodies removed, but of an ecosystem erased. The dark, hidden world the defenders trusted made suddenly transparent and lethal. Marines came armed with tools for that erasure, and the sight of a flamethrower tank chaining flame into a bunker became a legendary terror in the vocabulary of Japanese soldiers. Peleliu sits in Marine memory as something close to a private hell, and the Japanese defenders called it the Emperor's Island. General William Rupertus predicted a 4-day action. The island instead yielded around 2 months of agony. The Marines were confronted with a landscape of ridges and caves that transformed their forward momentum into a grinding, cost-exacting slog. The 1st Marine Division, seasoned and prideful, found itself consumed in a fight where every yard demanded flanking, explosives, and more detailed combined arms planning than anyone had recognized when the fleet first came into range. For the Japanese, Peleliu confirmed a doctrine of denial by attrition. If the Marines could be muzzled at the cost of such blood, then perhaps the strategic calculus of the Allies could be unsettled. The bitterness of Peleliu and the casualties the Marines accepted to close down Japanese fields of fire deepened the mutual awareness. The Marines were not mere landing parties, but a force willing to grind victory from positions that seemed unassailable. When men decide to fight to the last, it often becomes a question not of who hates whom more, but of who can make the other pay more for each inch. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi on Iwo Jima understood this with the clarity of a condemned strategist. He could not win in the sense of prevention, but he could make the taking so costly that the Americans would have to pause before invading home islands. That was not hatred as childish insult. It was military calculus mixed with an emotion: desperation, duty, and anger on the Marines. Readiness to accept horrific casualties to seize strategic real estate made Kuribayashi both dread and respect them. The resulting choreography on Iwo Jima's defense of the beaches, early, sudden violent interdiction from prepared interior positions, was the Japanese answer to a force they believed would otherwise rush them into surrender. The island's bitter weeks showed an unglamorous truth. Marines were patient killers of time and ground, trained to wait through spray, mortar, and smoke until a seam presented itself and they could pry it open. Listen closely to the accounts of infantry and tank crews in those battles and a pattern emerges. The Marines had a way of making combined arms coordination feel personal. Naval gunfire would lift and fall like a giant's breath. Carriers would spool fighters to strafe and suppress, and the armor often modified, sometimes converted to flamewood roll where the surf left a lane. Flamethrower Shermans and converted Satan. Tanks did what men with rifles could not in the labyrinth of coral and lava. They reached into bunkers and pinned the defenders with a heat that turned denial into surrender or death. The effect on morale among Japanese garrisons cannot be overstated. A bunker that once promised concealment now became a furnace, and the instruments the Marines used to create that furnace, tanks, fuel, coordinated fire, were the tools of invaders' inevitability. Veterans later described seeing whole systems of defense unravel when those tanks arrived. For many Japanese soldiers, facing a flame projector was to encounter a new inhuman weapon that made the idea of safe shelter meaningless. But hatred and fear are not simply the products of technology. They are forged in the grind of small unit fighting where reputation matters. The Marines brought a reputation for tenacity, chesty pullers mythos, the hard discipline of Guadalcanal vets, the stories carried forward in letters and newspapers, and reputation has consequences. A garrison that had observed Marines holding through for days of sea spray and shells would internalize a brutal arithmetic. You can kill many Marines, but that does not end the attack. In the Pacific, where islands afforded no easy retreat, that arithmetic mattered. Commanders began to treat Marine assaults differently, to plan not to repulse them at the beach but to shape the hinterlands into killing grounds, where the price paid by the attacker could be multiplied. The result was a cycle. Marines adapted to the new defenses, Japanese defenses hardened in response, and both sides paid the cost in tactics, time, and lives. The hatred, if hatred is the correct word, grew from the collision of competence and necessity. There were also cultural elements at play, too often flattened by historians into neat lines of cause and effect. The Japanese code of Bushido and a military creed that valorized death rather than surrender made for a particular kind of resistance that was both admired and feared by Americans. Marines met not only soldiers but a social system that had dedicated itself, in many cases, to die on hills and in caves rather than accept capture. Yet the Marines' own esprit de corps, their small unit leadership, and the way they integrated close air support into the life of the infantrymen created a moral psychological wall the Japanese found hard to inhabit. Marines fought differently from the armies the Japanese had seen in China or Southeast Asia, closer, coordinated tightly with naval fire, and with an institutional willingness to absorb casualties to seize terrain. That combination produced tactical frustration and emotional intensity and toward a force that refused the simple pleasures of surrender or rout and instead kept returning like the tide itself. Consider the small things the defenders noticed. The Marines' tactic of island hopping meant that every landing could be the prelude to a larger encirclement. Amphibious squads operated under a doctrine that treated every beach as inevitable. The Japanese recognized the strategic value the Marines placed on small islands as stepping stones or fields anchorages, staging points, and became resolved to make those stepping stones lethal traps. In messages and post-battle interrogations, Japanese officers often expressed a grudging respect for the logistical prowess the Marines brought ashore. Fuel, water, artillery, and the ability to resupply under fire. A force that could sustain itself after the first hellish hours of landing was in the calculus of defense, a force that would ultimately grind you down unless you made the cost of taking ground prohibitively high. That urgency reshaped Japanese fortification strategy from exposed line-in-the-sand defenses to staggered, subterranean emplacements designed to outlast barrages and force the Marines into room-by-room violence. And then there was the brutality of close combat, the narrow corridors of caves, the slim vents of pillboxes where Marines became specialists in route and clear operations. Men trained to fight in open Pacific heat found themselves crawling into darkness with satchel charges, flamethrowers, and grenade bundles, each step a whisper of heat and metal. The psychological signature of that kind of fighting is twofold. For the attacker, it breeds a cold, efficient cruelty born of necessity. For the defender, it feeds a particular intimate terror, the realization that concealment is temporary, that the small dark room you trust can be turned into an oven. Reports from the field noted how Japanese soldiers, when finally found in those spaces, were transformed from proud fighters into exhausted shadows. That transformation, observed by both sides, fed the sense among Japanese ranks that the Marines did not merely defeat positions but unmade the interior life of defense itself. Beyond tactics and tools, history teaches us about the weight of precedent. The Marines' early victories, Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Tarawa, created a narrative. Each victory taught the next garrison a costly lesson. Japanese intelligence and senior staff studied the casualty lists and after-action reports. They measured how much force the Marines could absorb, how they improvised when boats were stranded on reefs, how they called for fire and received it. Over time, a mental image took shape. The Marines were inexorable and inventive. Strategists like Kuribayashi internalized this image and altered plans. Accordingly, not because they hated the men in green and khaki, but because history had shown that Marines were a particular kind of hazard, politically important, energetically supported, and doctrinally committed to seizing ground at enormous price. That reality shaped the Japanese approach to defense and, in subtle ways, their feelings toward fighting the cause. We should be precise. To say the Japanese hated fighting Marines is to lean on a powerful, shorthand emotion that overlays many motives: fear, respect, tactical frustration, cultural clash. In primary sources and officer reports, there are expressions of admiration as well as loathing. Japanese commanders lamented the courage of their opponents, even as they resolved to make them pay. Sometimes historians note direct quotations of bravado from Japanese commanders before battles, and afterward an accounting of loss and the grudging appraisal of Marine skill. This mixed-register admiration entangled with anger creates the clearest historical picture. The Marines were singled out not because they were uniquely savage, but because they were uniquely effective in the amphibious, attritional environment Japan tried to hold. Look at the tactical aftermath. The innovations the Marines introduced in response to Japanese defenses changed the conduct of the entire island campaign. Flamethrower tanks, improved close port coordination, new methods of clearing subterranean galleries and bunkers all became staples because the corps had to solve problems the Japanese created. This was an arms race of improvisation. Japanese engineering of defense forced American engineering of offense. Each time the Marines introduced a technical or doctrinal fix, the Japanese countered with deeper dugouts or more disciplined fields of fire. Each cycle ratcheted up the stakes. For men on both sides, this could feel less like war and more like mutual escalation until exhaustion, supply, and attrition decided the day. The result was a Pacific theater in which the Marines were both the tip of the spear and the object of an anxious, almost personal opposition. There are individual human stories threaded through these larger patterns. Co-officers who argued in prefectural charcoal for holding ground at all costs. Marine corporals who wrapped their hands around reef rock and found themselves alive by chance tank. Crews who remembered the scream of flame and the silence that followed. In personal papers and regiment histories, men recall eyes meeting across a crater and finding in that gaze the awful certainty that the other would not leave. Those moments are where hate becomes something textured. Sorrow for comrades lost, fury at the mechanics of attrition, and a clarity in memory that the opponent was not faceless but a particular kind of foe who demanded new tactics and new sacrifices. The Corps' own record is full of reverence for those sacrifices and an understanding of how reciprocal the agony of those islands really was. We must not let the cinematic flourish obscure the cold arithmetic of the campaigns, logistics, ship movements, ammunition expenditure, the rate at which resupply could arrive under bombardment. All of these shaped outcomes. Marines who landed on islands were supported by fleets and carriers and the industrial hum of American production. That iron background made the Corps more than a criminally stubborn troop. It made them the tip of a state's capacity. From the Japanese perspective, whose supply lines and strategic options were ever tightening by 1944 to 45. Facing the Marines meant confronting an enemy whose industrial backing and operational coordination could render sacrifice strategically ineffective. It's one thing to win a battle in spirit. It is another to make a tactical victory change the course of war. The Marines, by virtue of their support and doctrine, were positioned to do the latter end that made them uniquely feared. So when scholars or veterans say the Japanese hated fighting Marines more than other units, what they are often pointing to is not mere emotion but a complex converging set of realities: amphibious mastery, relentless combined arms integration, psychological terror delivered by weapons like the flamethrower, the institutional willingness to absorb losses for strategic gain, and the steady pressure of American logistics. Those realities forced Japanese commanders to change how they thought about defense, away from open field repulse to subterranean attrition, and to recognize the Marines as an enemy that would test doctrine, courage, and the limits of sacrifice. The result was a Pacific War in which each island became a microcosm of adaptation, fear, and grim respect. In the end, the story is not one of simple hatred but of an escalating professional respect that time hardened into something resembling loathing. Loathing for what the Marines represented: the capacity to come ashore, to sustain, to adapt, and loathing for the cost exacted when those capacities collided with a defender dedicated to die. The Marines became, for Japanese defenders, the measure against which defensive genius was tested and, too often, found wanting. That bitter dialectic: one side inventing defenses to impose cost, the other inventing offenses to negate those defenses, was the engine of the Pacific. It left trenches and shell-pocked ridges in the generation of men who carried memory like a wound, insisting on both the horror and the necessity of what had been done. If you step back from any single island and look at the campaign as a whole, the pattern becomes clear. The Marines were not simply another Allied formation. They were the instrument of a strategy that turned the ocean into a highway for force and the island into an argument about will. Japanese commanders responded with ever deeper countermoves. In doing so, they expressed not only tactical resistance but a living, reactive emotion toward the Marine zonies, mixed with admiration, respect braided with fury. To study why the Japanese hated fighting American Marines more than any other unit is therefore to study how two forms of military culture, one amphibious and industrial, the other sacrificial and defensive, collided and reshaped the map of the Pacific. It is a story of tactics, technology, and human hearts measured against coral and flame. And finally, there is a quieter truth: hatred and respect can coexist in the same sentence. Survivors from both sides spoke of each other in terms that mixed contempt with recognition. The Marines learned to respect the stoicism and ingenuity of their foes. The Japanese, in turn, measured the course and found in it something neither to be envied nor easily despised, a force that would not be satisfied with retreat, that would come ashore no matter the weather, and that would pay any price to hold what it had taken. That contradiction is the emotional residue of the Pacific, where valor and horror shared the same geography in every beachhead. Was a line in an intimate, terrible conversation between human wills. What remains when the smoke clears is not a single, clean answer, but a ledger of reasons, doctrine, technique, brutal adaptation, psychological terror, and the relentless logistics of modern war. The Japanese response to the Marines was shaped by all of them. The resulting campaigns were lessons in how two professional militaries can force one another toward extremes. In telling that story, we do not glorify the hate, nor do we simplify bravery. We try instead to make sense of why in that oceanic crucible the Marines became a particular kind of enemy, one to be dreaded, to be studied, and when the guns fell silent, to be remembered. The sun sets over a coral ridge where once men shouted and machines screamed. The islands keep their memories in the pattern of their rocks and the line of shells embedded in blackened sand. If you listen closely, you can still hear a tide of voices, orders, prayers, curses woven into the surf. Those voices ask a question we have been circling, not simply why did the Japanese hate fighting American Marines, but what did that hate cost, and what did it teach us about the price of choosing to stand and the price of choosing to take? The answer lies not in a single quote or victory parade, but in the living ledger of strategy and sacrifice that every island recorded in blood and sand. The question lingers in the air like smoke after a barrage. What did hatred mean when filtered through the tunnels of Iwo Jima, the ridges of Okinawa, the black reefs of Tarawa? Hatred in war is rarely a clean emotion. It grows from exhaustion, from fear, from the steady erosion of hope. As 1945 began, Japanese commanders faced a reality impossible to hide. The Marines, scarred, hardened, endlessly supplied, were now the vanguard of an approaching storm. Each island seized brought the war closer to the home islands, closer to the final confrontation the Japanese High Command had dreaded since Midway. Within that dread, the sense of facing the Marines again grew like a rumor in the ranks. These men do not stop, and when they come, something ends. It was not simply tactical fear, it was the fear of inevitability. Okinawa turned that inevitability into something almost unbearable. The largest amphibious operation of the Pacific, it unfolded not as the swift strike many planners hoped for, but as a grinding, rain-soaked ordeal where Marines and soldiers advanced through mud and monsoon, over ridges carved into mazes of fire. Lieutenant General Matsuru Oshijima and his Chief of Staff Isamu Seiichi constructed a defensive masterpiece: defense in depth, artillery hidden in caves, counterattacks designed to bleed attackers slowly. The Marines, already exhausted by years of island fighting, found themselves in a battle where every advance meant carrying ammunition uphill, dragging wounded back through sheets of water and smoke, and facing defenders who seemed to grow stronger the deeper they fell back. Hatred here was fused with awe. Marines later wrote that their enemy fought with a kind of resigned ferocity that felt more like ritual than resistance. Yet for the Japanese, the hatred turned inward. Hatred of a war that offered no escape. Hatred of commanders who demanded death as proof of loyalty. Hatred of the relentless enemy who, despite everything, kept finding a way to break through. But beneath that mutual bitterness was a cracking foundation. The Japanese soldiers on Okinawa were told the Marines would show no mercy, that capture meant torture or humiliation, propaganda sharpened by desperation. Many only learned the truth in their final moments, when medics crawled through bullet fire to drag them out, when Marines offered water to dying enemies, when the grim logic of the battlefield briefly softened into something human. Those moments mattered. They carved small windows of understanding into an otherwise brutal landscape, and they left a different kind of emotional residue on both sides. The realization that hatred had been fed, shaped, and weaponized by leaders far removed from the mud. For Marines, Okinawa became the heaviest psychological burden of the entire war. After weeks of fighting through the Shuri Line and the southern ridges, after absorbing kamikaze strikes that turned blue seas into flaming wreckage, they confronted the cost of pushing any farther toward Japan. Casualty reports, letters home, and reflections by regimental commanders all show the same quiet dread. If Okinawa was a preview of Kyushu or Honshu, then an invasion of Japan might become an event of indescribable horror. Marines saw children used as shields, civilians driven to cliffs by fear and propaganda, entire families crushed in caves where they had taken shelter. These sights did not fuel hatred of the Japanese as a people, they fueled hatred of the war itself, hatred of the machinery that made civilians into pawns and soldiers into sacrifices. And within that swirling mixture of grief and anger lay the final unspoken truth. The Japanese defenders had feared the Marines because the Marines represented a force that could break even the strongest defensive system the empire could build. When the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Japan finally surrendered, the Marines prepared for an invasion that would never come. Many were relieved. Others were haunted by what they had seen and what they had expected to see next. The Japanese, emerging from smoke and ruin, encountered Marines not as storming invaders, but as occupiers with rations to spare, cigarettes to offer, and a quiet professionalism that contradicted years of propaganda. Former enemies bowed in greeting. Marines stood silently in return. The hatred that had grown through years of island combat did not vanish, but it lost its purpose. It melted back into the air like old gunpowder, leaving behind only memory, and the knowledge that it had shaped decisions, defenses, and deaths on both sides of the Pacific. History sometimes tries to distill that hatred into a simple sentence. The Japanese hated fighting Marines because Marines were relentless, but the truth runs deeper. The hatred emerged because the Marines embodied a style of war that nullified Japanese strategy, a combination of naval power, amphibious precision, industrial logistics, adaptive infantry tactics, and a cultural tenacity that made them maddeningly difficult to break. Japanese doctrine met its match not in a single weapon or a single island, but in a cumulative realization. Wherever Marines landed, the outcome, though costly, became a matter of time. Time, in a war already lost strategically, became a wound Japanese defenders could not heal. And so the story ends not with spectacle but with silence. A quiet beach at low tide. Wind moving across rusted shell casings, half buried in sand. The sun falling across bunkers now softened by moss. These islands, once arenas of hatred, now hold only the echoes of it, softened, scattered, carried away by waves that care nothing for flags or uniforms. If you kneel and press your palm to the ground, you may feel nothing. But if you listen, really listen, you might sense the weight of what happened here. The struggle of two forces pushed to extremes, the human cost of doctrines built on sacrifice, and the fading memory of a hatred forged in places where no side left unchanged. And perhaps that is the lasting truth. The Japanese did not hate the Marines because they were American. They hated fighting them because the Marines forced them to confront the limits of their own strategy, their own endurance, their own myths. And when hatred meets reality on a battlefield, what remains is not victory or defeat, but the quiet, enduring echo of men who fought, suffered, and carried the memory long after the guns went silent.
If you've stayed to the end, you're one of the few who still wants the truth. Subscribe, and together, we'll uncover every secret the Second World War tried to keep buried.